Um, Hello, everyone. My name is Kelly Shiohira with the Global Science of Learning Education Network, an international organization dedicated to the better integration of what we know about how people learn into education policy and practice. I'm joined today by Dr. Paul Howard Jones, GSoLEN Scientist of the Month for September 2025. He's a professor of neuroscience and education at the University of Bristol and has a very unusual background with training in engineering, psychology, and medical physics. He has a classroom teaching background and now a professorship. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure.
So, as a bit of an introduction, could you tell us some about your work and what you're busy with these days?
I suppose I'm best known for work on neuromyths, which I guess I've sort of edged away from that to some extent because it is important that we try to flush out these misunderstandings about the brain. But I'm also interested in what neuroscience can actually offer in a positive way in the classroom. So my work has been focusing more on that. And then I guess recently, the last few years, I have begun to be more concerned about climate change and the environment. So I'm very interested to know what the science of learning can offer in terms of fostering environmental awareness and changes in attitudes and behavior. And currently I'm undertaking a review with Michael Thomas at Birkbeck on the cognitive neuroscience of climate change education.
Oh, it's all amazing and fascinating. Let's take them kind of one at a time. In your neuromyths work that you're kind of moving away from, what would you say are some of the key takeaways or messages that you wanted to share with the education community?
Well, it's always an opportunity to try to get rid of some of the worst misunderstandings, and learning styles always crops up as being the most prevalent neuromyth. But it's another chance for me to say there really is no educational advantage in identifying somebody's learning style in terms of visual, auditory, kinesthetic, and teaching to that learning style. I mean, yes, we have preferences, and they're even quite stable. So if I came back, if I asked you today what your preference is, do you have a preference, Kelly? Auditory, visual, or kinesthetic?
Uh, that's a really good question. I guess I don't
I
think
could, see, I could give you a
I'm not,
self-report survey, but that would take longer. So I thought I'd just
and
ask you
I
straight
would
out.
be a blip in your data because I'm like I'd circle all three. Um, yeah, I guess probably I don't know. I guess maybe kinesthetic. I feel like I pick things up through physical repetition quite well, but I don't. Yeah, no.
Okay,
I
so
mean,
if
I
you
think this
said
is why it's a myth, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you say kinesthetic, well, it's a myth. It's a myth in the sense that there's no advantage to me teaching you as a kinesthetic learner. But the fact that you have a preference for receiving things, in a physical way, so you can feel them, and I mean, and the shape of things is very important to you, and actually, enactment and those sort of things. I mean, that's great. And actually, if I asked you tomorrow, it would probably be the same answer. So there's a sort of stability there. The myth comes when it's actually if I start thinking, oh, there's a real advantage in me teaching Kelly using kinesthetic information, and I won't worry about the auditory and I won't worry about the visual, because actually there's no advantage in that. And the brain is so interconnected anyway that, if I say, or if I show you a picture of a bell, your auditory cortex is going to activate because you've become to associate that picture of a bell, the idea of a bell, with a sound. So the brain is very, very interconnected, and there is just no behavioral evidence either to suggest that there's a really strong advantage in just me teaching you through kinesthetic, information. So yeah, I mean, all these things, arise. There's some element of science, some element of scientific fact. Like, yes, we do have visual cortex, auditory cortex in the brain. We have somatosensory cortex, but there's no advantage in teaching to those modalities. What there is an advantage to is actually using all of those modalities and representing the same concept in lots of different ways, taking advantage of the fact that we have all of these different senses, because then the brain is being encouraged to make links between these different representations, and that gives you multiple representations in your brain of that concept, makes them more accessible. So, these things can be a little bit tricky to unwrap sometimes. And you can even be guilty sometimes when you're trying to dispel a neuromyth of setting off other misunderstandings. Like, there's no advantage in ever using different modalities. Well, there can be a lot of advantage in doing that if you do so thoughtfully. But no, teaching to learning styles, whatever the learning style, and there's so many different learning styles available these days, but there's still no proven advantage in teaching to a self-reported learning style.
So I'm just going to ask one follow-up question. Why do you think this myth is so prevalent in the education community? It's caught on in the same way as that you remember 90% of what you teach kind of structure that was so
Yes.
common a decade ago.
Yeah, I mean, it's wishful thinking in a way. I mean, everybody's reaching out for things which, could be an easy solution, and it's just quite an attractive idea, isn't it? Because we want to personalize, we want to consider our students as individuals, and we know that actually they are individuals, and we know there's a lot of advantage in getting to know your learner and teaching in a way that they respond to. So if you just sort of systemize that in a very simple way, give out a self-report survey. Oh, yes, you're a visual learner. Then I can just teach you visually. It's a really nice shortcut to having to think in a more deeper and complex way. So a lot of this is wishful thinking. But of course, the other thing is this gap between neuroscience and education, and a lack of dialogue and a lack of talk about science of learning in teacher training. That creates the conditions for this wishful thinking to generate these misunderstandings.
Yeah, I mean, you'd be very proud of me, to be honest. At the start of the school year, my son's teacher sent home a survey that included a question on his learning style, and I responded that, like all learners, he learned best through multisensory reinforcing inputs. So let's
Yeah.
see.
Oh, no. I've actually seen staff training sessions at my university on this as well, which have been horrifying. So it's very, very prevalent still.
Yes, it's everywhere. So let's turn a little bit to your current work then. So you've shifted focus a bit, and now you're looking at climate education, climate change education. What predicated that shift? And tell us a little bit more about what you're investigating.
Well, in a way, it's sort of going full circle. I think, like, certainly my life has been a little bit circular, I suppose. But I mean, because originally I was a design and technology teacher, and I was very interested in developing projects with the children that would encourage them to think about sustainability. And in fact, the first book I ever produced was a book on sustainable design and technology projects. It was a textbook for teachers and children. But then I became a psychologist, and then I started getting into neuroscience and doing basic neuroscience research as well. And then applying that in education in a general way. And I suppose somewhere along the way, I sort of was paying less attention to issues of the environment and sustainability. But I think climate change has become such a big, pressing, urgent issue that 7 or 8 years ago, was it? Probably longer than that now, 8 or 9 years. I just thought, actually, this is so important. I can't ignore it anymore. I want to shift my research in this direction, and hope that maybe some of what I've learned about the science of learning could be applicable in this area.
And are you finding that it is? And if so, in what ways,
Yes and
please?
no. Yes and no. It's always the same, isn't it? It's never an easy answer. I mean, yes. I mean, I started off because I think one of the ways in which we try to teach our trainee teachers here, and I know is being taken up by other institutions as well, I'm pleased to see, is to think about three very important categories of learning process. The processes by which we engage with information, the processes by which we build the new concept in our head, and then the processes by which we consolidate it and make it more permanent. And of course, knowledge and understanding is a very important part of sustainability and climate change education as well. So that part is still relevant. But I think what's really I've found challenging but also fascinating about climate change and sustainability education is that you also are trying to change attitudes, and you're trying to change behaviors, and you're trying to empower the student to take action. And that's very different from most other curriculum areas in school. And so I found myself getting involved with a lot of social psychology, and understanding a lot more about attitudes and beliefs and values, which has also helped me, actually in other areas. But I mean, one example of that is that recently I was working with UNESCO to produce a report on the links between child development and sustainability education. Understanding, for example, how children's empathy develops and how that gives rise to, first of all, an empathy for people, but then an empathy for creatures and empathy for the environment around. And then how, later on that builds into reasoning and scientific knowledge, and how adolescent development can sometimes disrupt environmental approaches. So we see this sort of almost a pubertal dip, if you like, in environmental attitudes at adolescence, and trying to understand that in terms of brain structure, so that we have, I guess that insight helps us and prepares us to be able to take different strategies when we're delivering climate change education, ones that are based more on peer response. So social norms become incredibly important when you're a teenager, what your friends are thinking. And so discussion, and also, researching what other people think can actually be a really helpful way of changing teenagers' views and opinions actually about the environment, or perhaps just helping them, back to where they were in terms of thinking positively about the environment. So yeah, so that's been really interesting, and it certainly, I feel it's bearing fruit. So I'm quite excited about that, I think.
That's amazing. I wonder, is there any discussion around kind of links to this dip and risk-taking behavior or perceptions of risk in teenagers? Because I think that's a pretty well-studied phenomenon, that has to do with kind of evolutionary imperatives, I suppose, like the dangers of leaving home, the dangers of kind of exiting your community, and then, how that interacts with kind of teenage risk-taking behavior. You have to be able to, or willing to, take new risks and evaluate things in that way during that period of your life. So I mean,
Yeah.
maybe we'll cut this
Well,
part out, but
there's
I'm just
quite a few
curious.
things. There's quite a few things going on in the brain at adolescence. I mean, it's not the case that teenagers are just young adults or old
Hmm.
children. I wouldn't like to say they're another species, but certainly we shouldn't be thinking about them just in those terms. So one of the things that happens is that the reward system, for example, the thing that pushes you on to take risks sometimes, is actually, certainly structurally, it appears to be fully developed when you're 13 or 14, and you do see this maximum in terms of risk-taking behavior in some studies around about 13 or 14 years old.
Hmm.
So certainly the developmental changes can help us understand something about teenage risk-taking behavior, but also I think sort of more broadly, it being a time when students are breaking away from their parents, developing their own individual personalities, taking much more notice, therefore, of their peers, which again, actually, in terms of the social brain developing, you can see changes happening in there. And actually, it's been suggested by Sarah Blakemore, for example, that adolescence is potentially a sensitive period
Hmm.
for identity development. You get a sense of the vulnerability of a teenager, I think, and that sense, and perhaps we can remember this, or I can certainly remember it, that sense of isolation. That you do really feel you're on your own, and you feel that sense of pain, and a sense of anger, really, about being in pain and being isolated, I think. So it's not true for everybody, but it is true for many teenagers that I think they feel like that. And then you combine that with the issues around the environment and climate change. And you can see how eco anxiety starts becoming an issue, but also um, a sense of wanting to abide with the norms of your peers and the importance of that, and therefore not wanting necessarily to hear people sermonizing, but actually being given the opportunity to discuss with peers about these very important issues and not being ignored and being recognized as people who already have power, deserve to be more empowered, and soon will become adults.
So you used an interesting term there, eco-anxiety. Can you explain a little bit more what that is?
Well, I mean, I'm just stuck. I mean, okay, this is a really complex area, but I'm still trying to make up my
I
mind.
thought it was a simple question.
No, it's not.
Just kidding.
No, I think the literature. I mean, the way the research is turning out at the moment, I think there is a sort of a shift towards thinking that eco-anxiety is not necessarily the pathology that it has, or at least that sometimes the media has made it out to be, and that it is more of a rational, well, not just very rational, but it's a reasonable emotional response to the current situation that tends to lead to action, because that's what our emotions are for, actually. I mean, even the word emotion actually is derived from Latin meaning move. Yeah. And it's about being motivated to do things, and it's appropriate really to feel concern and to be worried about the environment. So at what point does it become a pathology? For a very small number of people, I think that the environment does crop up as one of the things that you can become quite obsessed with and overly concerned if it's at a point whereby it's interrupting your well-being, and your sleep and your overall health and your everyday life. So, but that we're talking about a small number, I think, and so it's complex. That's what I would say, and I think the when you see headlines saying 70% of children are suffering eco anxiety, no, I think this is another myth, really. And I don't think that we should be cutting back or not implementing more climate change education in schools because we're worried about worrying kids. I mean, that's a really crazy idea, because actually being informed about the environment and being supported in taking action and changing your behavior in relation to those emotions is what can help us escape. It's an appropriate response to those feelings that allows those feelings to be expressed in a positive way. Whereas if children will hear about these issues anyway, and if they're not being empowered to do something about them, that's when the problem really starts. And you're more likely to get an anxiety which is actually having a negative impact on your well-being and your life satisfaction. So, yeah, it's there's a sense in which we need to recalibrate, I think, our ideas around eco-anxiety. And I mean, certainly I collected some data recently and asked students, are you worried about the climate? Yeah, worried about the climate, but what other things are you worried about? Place them in order. How you get on with your friends, how you do at school, money, things like climate change comes right at the bottom. So a lot of it depends on how you ask the question, I think, as well.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. The perceived distance from the problem and the ability to influence it might be quite low. And lead to those types of ideas. So I want to change gears one more time, and I want to ask you about an article that you published earlier this year, The Journey from Educational Research to Classroom Practice. This is something we're very invested in as the Global Science of Learning Education Network. So I would love for you to share a few insights from that article and your thinking around
that. Well, I mean, it's interesting because I was talking about behavioural change with climate education and the fact that, I mean, a lot of it is actually about emotions. So if you're trying to encourage students to be motivated and feel empowered to take action. You need to be connecting with their emotions and feelings and values. And a lot of that same research is also true if you're trying to get teachers to use research findings in the classroom. Just as it's not good enough, or it's not often enough to just know about climate change, it's often not enough for teachers to just know about some research findings. That those things don't necessarily lead to any change in daily practice. We've got this knowledge action gap, if you like. And so what I did was, I mean, there have been other reviews of trying to look at the processes by which research findings end up in the classroom by teachers, teachers actually using research findings, but a lot of them are quite behavioral. And what I wanted to do was try and look at it from the perspective of the teacher and try to understand what processes are involved. And when I broke that down into 6 steps, and the first one was engagement, because you need to know the research findings are actually there. So you need to grab the attention of educators. Researchers are quite good at that generally. I think they know how to do that. The next one is understanding. You need to actually understand the findings. I mean, it's actually, I'm not sure how good researchers are at that sometimes. We recently asked a group in our research centre to produce a research brief and for teachers, and they worked hard on it. But when you put it through a reading analysis and you look at the reading level of difficulty, actually it's quite difficult to read, and then even if the teachers understand it, and you've achieved quite a lot if they've actually noticed your research and they understand your research, there's these things called values. And what gets a teacher out of bed in the morning? Why do they bother to do anything? It's really hard work. What actually gets them moving? And it's not always because you want to raise achievement in mathematics or literacy. I mean, for example, in primary school, a lot of it is about well-being of the children. Teachers turn up at primary school because they really care about their children's well-being. That's the first thing. So there's a whole load of other things that are happening here other than education that make teachers value something. And then even if they value it, so maybe you said, look, you understand this research and now you understand how important it is for the well-being of the child that they grasp these concepts because it's going to affect this and that, whatever. But somehow you found a way of appealing to their values. And I think it is quite difficult for a researcher to appeal to the values of a teacher. And we'll come back to that in a minute. Remind me.
Oh, I will.
and then there's also, they've got to commit to it. And there's a decision-making process. And do they feel able to actually implement these findings in the classroom? What's their emotional response to the whole area? So this is more of the social psychology stuff. And then when they've done that, they have to adapt it in some way to their particular context. Do they know how to adapt it? Because it's not going to be ready-made out of the box and it just sits there, this intervention or this research finding, and it does stuff for you. You're going to have to fit it to the context of the classroom. And there's very little research on that. I mean, if you look at educational research, psychology, certainly even less science of learning research on how teachers adapt findings in the classroom, how they adapt their practice, very little. And then they've got to sustain it because it's not a matter of them doing it once. They've actually got to, and a lot of that is about the management structures in the school and whether they feel the culture is supporting them and whether they're getting sort of positive feedback for what they're doing. It's a long route. And when you look at it like that, you think, well, it's hardly surprising that most educational research findings never end up in the classroom. I mean, you look at space learning is the classic one. Well, it was like 19th century, wasn't it? That I think they discovered space learning. We're still waiting for it to happen in schools. It's like 125 years or something ago. And you think, well, somebody hasn't been doing the communicating there really, or they haven't been thinking about, how it can integrate into practice. So yeah, there's a long chain. And then when you use this sort of framework, you can understand why some approaches, like encouraging teachers to become researchers, to identify the thing that they're interested in, to actually carry out a bit of research themselves in the class. Why that works, because they're obviously choosing something that's important to them, and that they are developing their own self-confidence as well. And it's the sort of thing that can help build the ethos or the prestige of the school, so that you can get the management on board. You can see how some of these things that do work, why they work. And you can also see why some things like brain gym and things that we don't really necessarily believe in the science of, why they are so successful at proliferating themselves around as well, because they're very good at communicating the principles. Whatever we might think as scientists about their principles, they're very good at communicating it. So yeah, so and it's also true that actually teachers, and this comes back to the point beforehand, that teachers prefer to hear research from other teachers. They care about the fact that it is authentic, published, peer-reviewed research. They really care about that. But actually, it's going to appeal to the values of the teacher more if they can hear about it from another teacher. And it's partly because, I think it's partly because the teachers have got the language and they've got the grounded experience as well, to be able to make it real, make it sound worthwhile, and they can give their opinions. Scientists don't like giving opinions. Teachers can give opinions. They can say, this is important, actually. This is fantastic. But the other thing, of course, is just in-group, out-group stuff. You just tend to trust people who you can relate to, who are, and scientists aren't always a group of people that teachers can necessarily relate to. So it's quite a long, it's a long answer, but
A lot of good stuff in there. Yeah, you were talking, I think a little bit, as you were talking, I thought, maybe you need to forge an alliance with your communications department in the universities and see how they would package these things. Because
yeah.
it does sound like a lot of like marketing strategy or kind of understanding almost consumer habits would is
Well, you're
maybe
so
very
right.
important.
Actually, you're
Yeah.
so right about that, because in some of the climate change work I've been doing, I've been working with energy companies trying to persuade customers to buy low carbon heat pumps, get rid of their gas central heating, get us off Russian gas, get us onto heat pumps, which are much better for everybody. And that it's the same psychology in a way that they need to turn onto as well if they're going to really form trusting relationships with their customers. Because in the UK, we are very behind with low carbon heating systems compared with the rest of Europe. So, yeah, it's funny you should mention the consumer science, because that fits nicely into it as well. In fact, when we put that review together, we did draw on some of the consumer data as well.
Fascinating. Well, it's been so interesting talking to you and hearing some of your insights. So I really, really appreciate you taking the time today. Um, what would you say is your parting shot, like last thing you want to share with the audience?
I I've become increasingly aware that so much of the progress that can be made in every area is actually about making connections and communicating. And that's one of the reasons why I've started my podcast, Mind, Brain, and Planet, to encourage people to think more about that, and to try to communicate what we understand about communication. um, so yeah, it's no good just producing fantastic results in the lab or even in an intervention with schools. We've got to learn how to bring other people on board with this stuff.
Fabulous. We'll provide a link to your podcast as well so people can follow up and hear a lot more from you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. It's been fun.